afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 12th installment of a public initiative hosted by the US Asia Institute, Southeast Asia in Focus. For those of you who have attended our event in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Joseph Izumi, and I'm the program assistant at USAI. For a bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Southeast Asia. This briefing will provide an overview of the political, economic, and military dynamics of Myanmar. Now, I would like to get the briefing started with just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I would like to give a special thanks for the support of USAID's corporate stakeholders for making this program possible. The SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. And I would also like to note that during the last 15 minutes of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question that you'd like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. Now, moving on to today's program, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator for this discussion, Professor William Wise. Professor Wise is the chair of the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia Forum. From 2005 to 2019, he managed the Southeast Asia Studies Program at the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. He was Deputy National Security Advisor to the Vice President, Chief of Policy at the U.S. Pacific Command, and Deputy Director of Policy Planning, East Asia and Pacific Region, Office of the Secretary of Defense. He retired from the U.S. Air Force as a colonel in 1997. We are very fortunate to have him with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Professor Wise, to introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this briefing.
It appears Professor Wise is having some technical difficulties at the moment. So with that, Joseph, would you please be able to introduce Ms. Clapp and Ambassador Marcial?
He may be trying to get in on the link that was provided earlier. Whoops, they've got me.
I can go ahead and introduce our speakers. If that is today. First, we have Ms. Priscilla Clapp. Priscilla Clapp is a senior advisor to the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Asia Society. She's a retired minister counselor in the U.S. Foreign Service. During her 30-year career with the U.S. government, Ms. Clapp served as Chief of Mission and Permanent Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Burma, Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in South Africa, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Refugee Programs, Deputy Political Counselor in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and Chief of Political Military Affairs in the U.S. Embassy in Japan. And we also have with us today Ambassador Scott Marcial. He is a senior advisor for Bowser Group Asia. Previously, he was a 2020-2022 visiting scholar and visiting practitioner fellow on Southeast Asia at APARC. A retired diplomat, Mr. Marcial served as U.S. Ambassador to Myanmar from March 2016 through May 2020, leading a mission of 500 employees during the difficult Rohingya crisis and a challenging time for both Myanmar's democratic transition and United States-Myanmar relationship. Prior to serving in Myanmar, Ambassador Marcial served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific at the State Department, where he oversaw U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. I'll now turn it over to Priscilla and then Ambassador Marcial to share their insights. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you to describe the domestic political scene in Myanmar, who's governing and who's not, what became of Aung San Suu Kyi and her political movement, the National League for Democracy, where the National Unity Government is, and so forth. Priscilla, over to you.
Thank you very much. That is an agenda worthy of a full book, but I will try to compress it into a few minutes. As everybody probably knows by now, there was a military coup on the 1st of February in 2021. So it's almost 2 years ago. And in the intervening 2 years since the coup, the country has basically fallen apart, and it's in a state of enormous conflict and disrepair, thanks to the military coup. The NLD was overwhelmingly reelected in the November 2020 elections, which is what led to the coup. I think the military was particularly the senior general, the head of the military, was really quite disturbed that the NLD had won such a victory, and he didn't see that as a good prospect for the future of the military control, what little control they had left of the government. So he decided they needed to take it over again. And right after, as soon as they staged the coup, they took the NLD cabinet, such as it was, under arrest, and they've held them all in jail since then. One or two people have been released, but most of the senior members of the previous NLD government, including Aung San Suu Kyi, are still in prison and being charged with all kinds of fake charges with made up laws that have been put on the books since the coup, some of them, with total disregard for the actual facts behind the issues being addressed in the hearings. At any rate, Aung San Suu Kyi herself is being held in solitary confinement in some kind of a bunker in Naypyidaw prison. She has been charged already with a number of counts, which I won't enumerate, but it all amounts so far to 20 or 30 years in prison, and they haven't finished yet. So I think that it is Min Aung Hlaing's determination to keep her locked up for the rest of her life, such as it is. The rest of the country the majority of the population has basically turned against the military in various forms. There are many, many different armed organizations in the country, beginning with the traditional ethnic armies, which we call EAOs, who have been fighting the military for a greater degree of autonomy for decades, many decades. These armies, in the process of their conflicts with the military, have become stronger, more organized, better equipped, and more in control of their territories. So you could say that the military has been fighting a losing war against these ethnic armies for many, many years. The rest of the country, the people who formed the elected government, plus the civil society organizations, many of the young people, particularly Gen Z, have risen up against the military, first in peaceful demonstrations. But when the military started shooting at them, not only shooting at them, but shooting to kill deliberately with snipers aiming at their heads and their chests and killing young people, they decided that they had to start defending themselves. So they began defending themselves with crude instruments and eventually migrated to much more lethal defenses. And they have formed into what they call People's Defense Forces, PDFs. There are several different names for these groups, but they're now scattered all over the country, and there are hundreds of them, particularly concentrated in the middle of the country where there were no ethnic armies. The ethnic armies tend to be in other areas in the states that are named after ethnicities, like Kaya, Kayin, and the Kachin and the Chin and the Arakan, Rakhine, so forth. And many of the students and the young people fighting against the military coup have fled to those areas. And many of the PDFs have joined forces with the ethnic armies to fight back. So there is a rather powerful resistance right now to the military, and they're giving the military what I would call an existential threat. They call their resistance movement the Spring Revolution. And I think it's aptly named because this really is the most serious uprising, revolution, if you will, that the country has ever staged. And I think that right now the resistance is winning because it has almost endless ability to reconstitute itself, whereas the army does not. The army depends upon being able to conscript people, and many people are defecting, many are getting killed. The army is fraying at the edges. And I think the morale is very low, but they have lethal weapons, and they are using these lethal weapons to burn down villages, to wipe out whole populations, send them into refugee status, either internally displaced or into neighboring countries. It's a terrible mess. One of the outcomes of this disorder that's been created by the military coup is the rise of a regional criminal network. It's basically run by overseas Chinese, many of whom come out of the triads. They're basically malign, illegal operators. And they're running online gambling and Ponzi schemes all over the region and reaching even beyond the region to other parts of the world. They have been able to position themselves now along the Thai border inside Burma, where there is really no law and order anymore. And they've partnered with border guard forces who serve under the Myanmar military. So you could say that the military is supporting this activity, and it is upsetting the region because it has very serious consequences for the neighboring countries, China especially, but China, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos are all suffering from this, and India too. Many Indians have been taken hostage inside these criminal networks. So that's just an example of what happens when a country begins to fall apart. And it's on its way to becoming a failed state. The military itself is very good at, well, as good as it can be, I suppose, because they're not very bright, but they're putting out a lot of propaganda that makes it look like they're winning, but the reality on the ground shows that they're not. The only reason they probably think they're winning is because they live in a very protected space in the capital city, at least the generals do, of Naypyidaw. And they have brainwashed themselves into believing that they are the saviors of the country. And it's clear that they're willing to destroy the country in order to save it, as they say. The opposition has formed something called the National Unity Government, the NUG, that is situated both inside and outside the country. It's much like the opposition to apartheid in South Africa that grew up over many, many years. And the NUG is rather a central connection for the resistance with the outside world, a centralized connection. It's still in the process of organizing itself. And I think this is a process that will continue because they're operating under very difficult circumstances. But they have formed this unity government that consists of former members of parliament from the NLD and other parties, as well as members of the ethnic armed forces, particularly Kachin, Karen, and so forth. And it is the first really unified resistance that has developed in the country. And we have great hopes for it. But there's a lot of, there is internal dissent that's visible on the outside. From a US perspective, and from my perspective, that doesn't worry me so much because there is unity of purpose, and they have articulated this really quite well in a charter agreement that they put together early on. They all are dedicated to removing the military from governance in the country. And they are dedicated to forming a federal democracy. And they are dedicated to fighting the military to this end. What the details of the end situation may be are still something that is up for discussion. And it will take a long, long time for that discussion to be completed because there has never been, the military has never allowed a real, honest national dialogue since independence, and independence came in 1948. So in that whole time, the people have not really been allowed to come together to have an honest national dialogue about how they want to unify this extremely diverse population. During the British colonial years, they identified 135 official ethnicities or nationalities, as they're called in Burma. That is an enormously varied population. They have many different languages, many different backgrounds, and they do want to find ways to preserve their history, but to live together as a union. And they would like to make it a federal union that has states, very much like the United States, but that the states have a much greater degree of autonomy than they do now under highly controlled, centralized military governance. At any rate, that's the situation in a nutshell. And I think I will leave, the external situation to Scott to describe because he's much better at that than I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. Scott, I want to move to the economy in just a moment, but first, I'd like to ask you if there's anything you'd like to add to Priscilla's very comprehensive description of the domestic political and security situation. In particular, I'm interested on the security side in following up on Priscilla's point that the resistance has proven to be very powerful and sustained, and that it poses an existential threat to the military. How does one, in a fluid situation like this, how does one measure this kind of strength? Are we talking about territorial control or population control or access in the country? What measures should we use to determine the extent to which one side or another is actually in the lead here?
I can give you my measures if that's what you're asking, or are you asking Scott?
I was asking Scott, but happy to have you.
Well, I'll just give you a brief list. It's all of the things you mentioned. It's popular support, it's territorial control, and it's fighting ability. The one sign of the threat that the military has that they are not acknowledging is that it's no longer safe for them to send ground forces into many parts of the country because they get slaughtered by the opposition one way or another. So they're using air power, in which they are predominant, to bomb, strafe, and burn what they conceive to be the parts of the country that are supporting the resistance. It could be in the ethnic areas, it could be particularly in the center of the country. The military has never been challenged before seriously in the center of the country because that's where the majority Bama population lives. And that's where the military recruited its support. It doesn't have that anymore. So it's particularly concentrating its destructive power on the center of the country, which is previously their support. But they've done a lot of damage in the Chin state that borders on India, a lot in the Rakhine state or Arakan, which borders Bangladesh and India, and a lot in the Karen state, which borders Thailand, where there's a real concentration of resistance forces. But between the ethnic armies and the resistance forces, the military is taking a serious beating like it's never had before. That's my measure.
Scott?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to the Institute for organizing this and inviting me to join. Priscilla covered it, very well. I just add a couple of points, including to respond to Bill's question. One, I think Priscilla was very implicit in what she said, but just to be 100% clear, this is not a civil war in the sense of having two elements or two forces with significant public backing against each other. This is a really brutal and hated military trying to seize power, and really a national uprising against it. And a national uprising, as Priscilla said, among what's otherwise a quite fractious population. And so the military really has almost no public support, and really no prospect of gaining that public support. So when we look at the metrics, as you said, Bill, I think it's not this. We shouldn't look at this as just a military battle. That's one aspect of it, but another aspect is support, public opinion, and so far the resistance has been incredibly resilient, despite the fact that the military is brutalizing the whole population to try to stamp it out. But I think it also gets into things like the economy, which I want to touch on. But first, because I think it's important, particularly for people who may not have been following Myanmar as closely. Priscilla didn't have time to mention what happened also before the coup, which is the Rohingya crisis, which we know has rightly gotten a huge amount of attention. That was under the previous government, where the military led, but with a fair amount of backing from the population, drove out nearly 1 million members of the Rohingya community who lived in Western Myanmar, drove them into Bangladesh. And that soured much of the world on the NLD government, and certainly cooled our relationship with the NLD government significantly. So part of the future rebuilding of Myanmar, if they can get the military out of power, has to be, of course, to address that. And we're seeing, since the coup, the beginnings of recognition among Bama and other members, people who may have not been very sympathetic to the Rohingya. That's beginning to change, but that's a long-term struggle and needs to be part of the discussion going forward. But last point on this, as long as the military is in charge, there's really no hope for the country. There's just no hope, politically, economically, socially, you name it, there's no hope. The resistance provides the only hope. I wanted to touch briefly on the economy, because that's another hugely important factor. The economy was doing reasonably well. Obviously, COVID affected it during the previous government, but military has mismanaged it, as they've mismanaged it before, horribly, and created a foreign exchange crisis, a banking crisis, but also a humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian crisis is caused by both the brutality of the military, but also the really bad economic conditions that have been created. In 2021, estimates are that the economy fell 18%. It's stabilized since then, but at a very low level, with massive humanitarian needs, more than 1 million people displaced. Lots of people have lost their jobs. Again, the banking sector is broken. So there's a semi-crisis economically already, but in terms of the vulnerability of the junta, the military junta, they're really on the edge economically as well, and it's important to think about that. Then I want to talk for a minute about how the world's responding to this, and I would divide it generally into 3 groups. You have a small number of countries, China and Russia most notably, but to a certain extent also India, and a few others who are just outright backing the military junta, selling it weapons. The Russians in particular have really stepped up since the coup, tried to turn it into almost a client state. China has been backing it. and India to a lesser extent, but to some extent has also been backing it. China and Russia in particular have been supplying the military with the and otherwise supporting it. So there's real tangible support there. The military relies on China, but they're wary of China, which is part of the reason they've turned to Russia for so much of it. Then you have another group that I would include ASEAN in this, that generally is either divided or not sympathetic toward the coup and more sympathetic to the public, but they're kind of taking a cautious approach and trying, ASEAN in particular, has tried to find a way to mediate and create some kind of domestic dialogue. They have a so-called 5-point consensus that they've been trying to implement for a year and a half. It's going nowhere because the junta is not interested in making any concessions. And then last but not least, you have the United States and much of the West and the democratic world, which is rhetorically strongly opposed to the coup and to the junta, very supportive of the democratic forces and the public of Myanmar. But outside some sanctions, has largely limited its actions to rhetoric. So you have a larger group that's supportive of the people and the resistance, but not offering that much tangible support, versus a smaller group that is offering tangible support to the junta. And there's tremendous frustration and unhappiness within the country among the Myanmar people. They see Ukraine getting all kinds of help and support. I recognize it's a different situation, but to them, we're both confronting these incredibly brutal militaries. One nation gets all this support and help, and we get lots of statements saying we're standing with you. So that's a source of incredible frustration. And I know folks in Washington and elsewhere are looking for ways to try to play a more active role. There's not a lot of easy options, but certainly trying to find ways to provide tangible support, including financing to the forces aligned against the military, is something that I hope we're looking at. I'll stop there.
Scott, let me hone in just for a moment on the regional effects of the problem that you initially addressed. But in Indonesia, a country with which you are quite familiar, having been U.S. ambassador there, assumes the chair of ASEAN next month. And Indonesia in the past has been occasionally outspoken on the subject of Myanmar. With Indonesia in the chair, do you expect ASEAN to take a little bit more, promote a little more greater involvement in seeking a solution?
Yeah, I would think so. I think Foreign Minister Marsudi and to a certain extent President Joko Widodo are quite sympathetic to the democratic forces and really unhappy with the coup. But again, even as chair of ASEAN, their ability to drive ASEAN, as you know, is quite limited, because with ASEAN, everything's by consensus. So, and it's hard to get a consensus of 10 countries or even the 9, not counting Myanmar. So that's going to be a challenge. But I do hope and even expect that Myanmar on its own as ASEAN chair can be more active. I mean, among other things, engaging the national unity government, which is really important, both to help the Indonesians and others understand what's really happening in the country, but also the symbolism and the moral support that would bring would be, I think, quite significant. So yeah, I do expect Indonesia to be more active. And
with regard to China, you mentioned that there are Chinese economic interests in Myanmar that are that the Chinese are pursuing both publicly and privately. But on a military side, is China actively supporting the Myanmar military with assistance, lethal assistance, first of all, and second, are the Chinese supporting any other groups in Myanmar, particularly those on their own border?
Yeah, well, the Chinese have been playing this game for quite a while, even before the coup. Yes, they're providing lethal assistance to the military. They also back some of the ethnic armed groups. Now, remember, not all the ethnic armed groups are fighting actively against the military right now. The Wa, for example, heavily influenced by China and armed by China, are not actively fighting the military, but others are. So this is not new. I mean, China's been doing this for some time, arming both sides My sense is, and obviously I can't speak for the Chinese government, I'm not sure that the Chinese government loved this coup or loves this military government. They probably don't. But they're looking for, they're being pragmatic, if you put it that way, and say, well, they've got ostensible power right now, so we'll work with them because we really want to get these big infrastructure projects that go from Yunnan province in southern China through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean. They really want to get those advanced. So they were happy to work with the Aung San Suu Kyi government. They're happy to work with the military government. If the military government gets driven out of power, I'm sure they'll be happy to work with whoever takes their place.
Priscilla, we've talked about the security situation on the ground, the desperate politics. Scott has mentioned the deteriorating economy. These are all contributing factors to move Myanmar towards a failed state status. On the other hand, it's not clear to some outsiders that there are specific internal factors or developments or external pressures that would influence movement toward a ceasefire and perhaps an eventual political settlement. What has to happen to move Myanmar from this teetering on the edge of a failed state to something to a set of political players that can actually resolve a political problem?
In short, a deus ex machina. It's difficult to predict what has to happen because it's always something you don't predict that happens, something sudden that can upset the whole balance of the conflict. And I would say that it's most likely to happen on the military side. As the military reaches further deterioration, there's a lot of discontent we hear at the middle level. It's the senior officers, all of the generals that live in Naypyidaw in splendor, palatial splendor, and the rest of them that are fighting the horrible battles on the ground that are very demoralizing. And it's right now they're afraid of the generals because the generals treat their own army the way they're treating their enemies. And they're scared. But at some point, it could happen that the mid-level will turn on the upper level, that something will happen to upset the balance inside the military. There's always a lot of internal competition going on in the military. Right now, Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general, has arrayed the generals around him that most support him. But it's a very weak government and it is losing control of the country. The opposition has decimated military administration and controls in many parts of the country and driven military out of those parts. But and there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of demoralization. At some point, it may be that those who are really fighting on the ground will say, okay, we've had enough, but we're ready to sit down and talk with you. The resistance is beginning to lay out the terms of negotiation, which would be agreement from the military that they would no longer participate in government, that they would strictly be a military. And I think that's the only way that the military is going to save itself in the end. So at some point, they'll have to say, okay, we want to be able to save ourselves as a military force. So we are willing to begin talking with the resistance about this. But it will be, I think, the resistance that calls the basic terms of the negotiation. And that will be one of them. The other one will be that there has to be a new construction, federal construction for the security forces that will no longer be strictly Burma Buddhist, as the military is. The military is an extremely nationalistic conservative group, and it is out of tune with the rest of the population. So it's going to have to change its basic philosophy. At any rate, all of those things, and just in order for people to save lives and institutions, that's going to have to happen. And once the negotiation starts, it's going to be a very long process, but it will start with a ceasefire of some sort. And once a ceasefire starts, the opposition may be in a position to put together some commissions like economic, judicial, and so forth, to begin putting democratic structures back in place in preparation for an elected government somewhere down the road. That's my ideal scenario. Of course, ideal scenarios never happen.
Scott, your thoughts on this? Is this a political problem that will be solved, or a solution will be stimulated by effects on the battlefield, or does the battlefield situation act as an impediment to a political solution? Where should we be looking for some movement towards a ceasefire and perhaps an eventual political settlement?
I agree with Priscilla. I mean, these generals are not like no people I've ever dealt with anywhere in the world. They're so damn hard line and brutal, and they don't care how many people they have to kill. So, you can't, this is the trouble with sort of the ASEAN, let's bring people together and start a dialogue. The environment, there's no space for dialogue. And the opposition, the resistance, if you will, they want the military out of power. So they're not willing to cut a deal to go back to the good old days when when there was an elected government, but the military still had a huge amount of power. So I think the only hope for a positive outcome, there's lots of avenues that lead to bad outcomes, but the only hope I see for a positive outcome is that the military is so weakened economically, politically, and on the battlefield that elements within the military say, as Priscilla said, we need to find a way out of this. And only then might they be willing to make some of the concessions. I'm not predicting this is going to happen, but that's the best outcome. But again, this military has been, this is the worst regime in Southeast Asia since the Khmer Rouge. You cannot overstate how bad these people are. And so it's not going to be easy. And it may take a long time to get to that point, if ever.
Can I just add one point about
sure,
the Chinese,
please do.
Bill? All of the resistance forces, the ethnic armies and the PDFs and all of the others are fighting with Chinese weapons, which they receive directly or indirectly from the Chinese. And the military is aware of this. So there's no love lost between the military and the Chinese. They think the Russians are their best friend right now.
Playing both sides, as Scott pointed out, playing both sides.
Exactly.
A familiar Chinese game. And might add that the Chinese are not the only ones who've ever played it. But thinking about what you now have said about the prospects for moving towards a ceasefire and a settlement, and how difficult this will be, are there actions that the United States can take? Are there changes that we might adopt in our own Myanmar policy that would be more instrumental in achieving these political goals, without recognizing that the United States certainly will not intervene to the extent that we are intervening in the Ukraine conflict? Nonetheless, that is a rather high bar. Is there some space under that high bar where the United States might act more indirectly but influentially? And before you answer, let me just say, I have been looking for questions from the audience on the Q&A, in the Q&A slot, and I do not have any. So we will continue with this discussion as is, but if a question occurs to you, audience member, please do submit that question via the Q&A function. Now, to the question, what can the United States do? Priscilla?
The United States, as Scott said, doesn't have access to the country. That's our major impediment to supporting the resistance. We simply cannot get in. The neighbors are effectively siding with the military, protecting the military right now by holding back and not allowing and letting the military seal the country off from even humanitarian assistance. It's very difficult to get assistance into the country directly. And the UN is basically hobbled by the military and has wound up playing their game in many ways. So it's not in our power to do the things that we might do and that we were doing before. In previous situations, we've been able at least to get humanitarian and other forms of assistance into the country through various legal channels. That's not possible now. We cannot provide lethal assistance to irregular forces in the country. It simply isn't the same as providing assistance to a standing army as we do in Ukraine, where we have access to the country. US weapons come along with US trainers and US forces. And Myanmar is surrounded by China and India, particularly, who do not want to see it made into a foreign war. So we have to tread around those impediments in that region. In the case of Ukraine, Putin's attack on Ukraine was really, and he's even said this himself, an attack on NATO. NATO is an alliance, a very strong military alliance, as you know. And an attack on NATO requires a NATO response, and that's the context for our response to the Ukraine situation. We don't have that in Asia. We do not have that kind of an alliance in Asia that could be employed to deal with an intrinsically internal situation such as we have in Burma.
Scott, sorry, go ahead, Priscilla.
So we're limited to indirect assistance, whatever we can get to the resistance, which we are doing. And I can tell you one thing, and particularly based on my government experience, we're not going to telegraph what it is, because it would be met with animosity in many different quarters, and it wouldn't help the resistance to be too open about what kind of support we can provide on the non-lethal side.
Thank you, Priscilla. That's very useful. Scott, the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act was recently amended to incorporate the Burma Act. What will this do, and will it make any difference to the problems that we have been, or solution of the problems we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think honestly, this may not be a popular opinion. I think the value is going to be largely symbolic. I think it helps in that sense. It gives a morale boost to the resistance. But again, I haven't read the word for word the latest version, but last I saw, it authorizes various things, including more sanctions and possible more funding, but there's no appropriations or no mandatory spending. So I think it's a positive in that sense, but I don't see it as a game changer. I do think that I agree with Priscilla. I mean, this battle, if you will, is going to be determined largely by what happens inside Myanmar. I do think that the U.S. has been taking the right approach. I'd like to see more energy behind it, more regular engagement with the national unity government and key ethnic communities, a greater diplomatic effort to mobilize and coordinate support among and strategy, and possibly a more financial assistance to the opposition forces, including but not limited to the NUG. But I don't think there's some, magical step that the U.S. could take that would fundamentally change the reality.
Bill, I would say in general, in general, it moves US policy forward by legalizing certain things that were just implicit in US policy before. And it puts more pressure on the administration for sanctioning Mogi. It doesn't force the sanctions of Mogi, but it does require a report on what the implications of sanctions on Mogi would be. And that will be important because it's mainly a consideration of Thailand, electricity in Thailand. And that hasn't been said explicitly by the US government, but we will see more about that. It also legalizes support to the PDFs and the EAOs, which in the past has not necessarily been legal. At one point, particularly when I was the chief of mission in Burma, we were not even allowed to talk with the EAOs because they were in a sort of a non-state situation. But now this legislation legalizes all of that. It doesn't mean lethal assistance, it legalizes non-lethal assistance, but it frees up the American government and government officials to deal directly with these forces. And that's actually very helpful.
That question was submitted by one of our member of our audience, for which we are very grateful. Another audience question, Scott, it has to do with the Rohingya population that remains inside Myanmar. Can you give us a brief rundown on their status? You are muted.
Sorry, I don't know the very latest in terms of numbers. So the Rohingya population, almost all of roughly a million, 1.2 million people was living in Rakhine or Arakan state in the west of Myanmar. They were basically facing an apartheid-like situation where they had virtually no rights for a number of years. The military operation in 2017, 2018 drove out about 750,000 into refugee camps in Bangladesh, where they remain. The estimate when I left in 2020 was that there were probably about 500,000 Rohingya still in Rakhine state. That's probably more or less the number still. Unfortunately, their situation hasn't changed in the sense of enjoying any more rights. And now they're also, well, they've been caught up recently in the fighting between the military and the Arakan army, which is an ethnic Rakhine community. So you have ethnic Rakhine who are Buddhist, and then the Rohingya who've lived side by side, sometimes well together, sometimes uneasily for generations. So they've been caught up in that fighting as well. But bottom line, about 500,000 still with very few rights. Although these days, nobody in Myanmar has rights. So, everybody else has fallen to that level, sadly.
Not necessarily a very positive evolution. We had one question that I think I might briefly answer because our two experts have discussed it already. The question is, why is the region, meaning ASEAN, I assume, ignoring this issue? Why are Myanmar's neighbors not getting more militarily involved? Is it that they want a weak Myanmar? And to have a kind of a flip but serious answer at the same time, it's not that they want a weak Myanmar, it's that they want a weak ASEAN. Sure, go ahead. But we have time for one more question, which I'm going to read momentarily.
One key point in responding to that, Bill, is that many of the neighboring countries and even countries in other parts of the world are looking at the proposal, the junta's proposal to hold elections in 2023 as a potential pathway to stability in the country, like it was in 2010. But that's not going to happen. In our view, the elections are going to be a magnet for further conflict. It's going, if they can even run them at all. So if they run elections, they'll probably have to be held inside military bases in order to be safe, because they don't have the administrative control over the country to run elections in most parts of the country now. So these elections are going to be a sham, but neighbors who don't really know that much about the situation on the ground are hoping that those elections will be a path to stability. In fact, in our view, the path to stability lies with the opposition.
I think it seems reasonably clear that the circumstances in 2023 are significantly different than the circumstances in 2010. You might even say egregiously different. A last question, brief and to the point. One of our audience members asks to you, where do you get your news about Myanmar?
I can tell you that I get it from many, many different sources, but principally from sources on the ground inside the country. We have Burmese on our staff. We have a large office that's run out of Bangkok. We have probably a staff that numbers in the 20s now, and it also incorporates some of the people that have fled the country, who still have direct access back into the resistance forces. We talk all the time with with leaders of the ethnic armed organizations and their civilian counterparts. We follow the local press. There's a lot of Asian press that covers Myanmar. You don't see much in the Western press, or particularly in the US press, but there is a lot in the region.
If
When
I
you
could
say-
just add,
Excuse me, just one question, one point. When you say we, Priscilla, could you?
I'm talking about the
clarify?
US Institute of Peace.
Good. And Scott,
yeah, I envy Priscilla and her team, but just as an individual working at Stanford University now, I mean, you can find some quite good Myanmar English language media. Irrawaddy, Frontier Myanmar, and Myanmar Now are three examples. If you read any or all of those, you'll get a fair amount of information. Obviously, it's not as comprehensive as what Priscilla gets, but I would point you towards those. They're all online and quite high quality.
thank you. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Priscilla. Both of you, this has been a very lively and informative conversation, and I'm delighted to have been able to be part of it, even belatedly. And I hope that we can continue the conversation into the future, because clearly the problem is not going away. So thank you to both of our excellent panelists. And on behalf of our panelists, thanks to you, our audience, for joining us and participating and submitting such interesting and provocative questions. We're glad we were able to talk to you today and to address your questions, and hope that we've stimulated your interest sufficiently that you will keep on top of the Myanmar situation into the future, because, as I said a moment ago, it isn't going anywhere.